What does Judge Rutherford's Imprisonment, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and the Watchtower's second trumpet blast all have in common? We'll explain it all. All aboard! Let's take another trip back to the past and back to the future.
So this is 1923.
The Enterprise is advertising the Los Angeles Convention, where the second trumpet blast was presented. We have a couple advertisements showing some of the talks that Rutherford was giving, as well as the outline of the New Era Enterprise, giving details of the convention.
Now it says there's a 35,000 here, and it's a record attendance. That is quite a number, especially for back then. What was the draw in that specific one that got everybody like, hey, we got to go to Los Angeles and hear this talk?
I think it was their advertising. Also, they were broadcasting by radio, right? So that's also something new.
So then but it does say record attendance at Coliseum, or is 35,000 with the radio and everything?
It's just at the Coliseum. Look at the numbers of how many Bible students there were then and go 5, 6, 7, 8 years later and look at the numbers, and they dropped.
Mm-hmm.
In the Watchtower in the Golden Age, there's not very much discussion about this particular convention and what was said. So without having the New Era Enterprise, we really wouldn't have a record of the details of what was said, other than the proclamation that's written out and a couple paragraphs that were in the Golden Age in Watchtower. It was this convention where Rutherford really starts taking the prophecies and parables and starts applying it to the Watchtower Society. A lot of it is that he was persecuted, and the Bible students were persecuted because of the Finnish mystery and their stance on the World War. They claimed that their persecution was an evidence that they were chosen of Jehovah. But there are a lot of Christians all over the world that are persecuted. An example of a good film to watch is one called Tortured for Christ. Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian Lutheran minister, suffered greatly for several years in the communist prisons under Ceausescu's regime.
That's an interesting point. I remember talking with my grandmother about Malawi. There was a big persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Malawi in Africa. And because my grandmother's whole life was just in Jehovah's Witnesses, she thought that was the only people going through any type of religious persecution. Even now in Africa, Muslims are slaughtering and killing Christians and burning churches. Does that make the Watchtower? Probably not, because they're not Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least exemplified like this. So that's what I used to discuss with her, but she was in just her own little realm of that's all the news she got without any time for anything else. So here you go. You're showing, books that say just the opposite.
And the focus of Jehovah's Witnesses today are what they were suffering in Russia. A lot of the news from the Russian front is that many Jehovah's Witnesses are being put in prison just for preaching. But it's not just Jehovah's Witnesses going through persecution. This Tortured for Christ film is led by an organization that focuses on persecution of Christians all over the world.
It reminds me, when I went to China a few years back myself, my seat was next to a young Chinese girl. I can't remember going or coming. And she was saying she wanted to practice her English because they don't get to practice as much. And she had somebody to sit next to who understood English. And one of the things on her mind, she asked, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." And she goes, "Me too." And that there's probably not too many Christians in China. And she said, "No, and I go, "Do they give you a hard time?" And she just said, "Well, they don't like it. So we don't get too, boisterous about it." Whereas the Jehovah's Witnesses at times, Rutherford has even stated about publicity. when you create a persecution or create an issue, when it creates an issue, it brings attention to you. So that's not the whole point of why they're doing it.
It's free advertising.
So the proclamation.
So at this convention was the proclamation or the warning to all Christians. It was a resolution. The proclamation is what they claim is the trumpet message. They printed it in the Golden Age, but there's very, very little. And so what's the message of that proclamation?
Exactly. What is it?
Basically, the message is, we warned them, they didn't listen. And it's interesting to go back and look at that, because a lot of what was said is not what is believed today by the Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you believe that was a trumpet message, your message is completely different today. I think they're going to have to start changing the way that they look at Revelation if they went back and look at these trumpet messages. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, you can't have a proclamation of false information. Then it's not a proclamation. It's false advertisement, technically, if you want to be split hairs about it.
Unless you just want to generalize it. Well, it was a warning. Who cares what the warning was? They didn't listen to our warning, and so therefore they're going to die horribly in Armageddon. And it's the same thing with the Jews. We warned them, they didn't listen, so we're the only chosen ones.
So they're basically claiming they even had to warn the Jews themselves.
Rutherford is talking here about Jewish regathering, but he starts tweaking it a little bit. He's suggesting here that the reason the Jews returned to Palestine in the 20s is because they had faith. But a few years later, when they didn't listen to his message, they said, well, they have no faith at all, and so therefore we're the Jews. This is where the replacement theology started. And once you start replacement theology, it's a slippery slope from which there's no return.
You can't unreplace what you place.
At this convention, he's still pushing 1925. And this is both during the first and the second trumpet.
And there's tangible evidence.
Right. Millions now living will never die. You know, it's just a couple years away. And a couple years after, then it became millions now living will die horribly in Armageddon if they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. The theology changed based on how Rutherford was feeling and how people were reacting to his message as time went on, right? And this is also the convention where he starts the discussion on the separation of the sheep and the goats. This is where the change came in. And the real question for that is not what the change was, but why was there a change? Stay tuned to the end and we'll explain it. By the time you get to 1930 and Rutherford's book Light, he's talking about this trumpet message, and he basically says, we gave them a warning, they didn't listen. So your warning was enough.
And back then, with what was going on in the world, they could focus on where they were at that point in time, that stream of time, and say, we gave that warning. Just like now, the Great Tribulation is, we're given the warning for that. So these messages change from decade to decade, because in World War II, there were other messages and proclamations and defiances against the church and whatnot. But like you said, they always seem to go back to the 1919s proclamations and stuff for the Cedar Point and from the henceforth.
Right. And we saw some of the reason why for that, because remember how they're interpreting the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days. They were trying to force that interpretation to go from one convention to another convention. So even though there were other proclamations, other warnings, they can't really choose them because it doesn't fit the narrative of those dates.
What made them get so obsessed, if you will, or fixed on conventions being so important in their history, in their doctrine, actually? We're
going to get into that in a little bit, but I think a lot of the point is that they were trying to assert their authority. They're trying to prove their authority. So if the prophecy is about you, then it proves that Jehovah has chosen you. And so if
they decided to use the conventions as that authority.
Right. And so if you read Light and you read some of the Watchtowers of the time, they talk about, we didn't plan the date of the convention. That's what was given to us. And it happens to be exactly 1,260 days and 1,290 days. And well, we talked about that in a previous discussion. It's not exactly that many days. That was fudged to make it work. And as time went on, they had to be more generic with it and more generic with it, because they realized it didn't quite fit. So the more generic you make an interpretation, the more you can make it apply to yourself. So in the proclamation, they make generalized statements about other Christians, or even about a lot of the other splinter groups.
Now, when you read each of these seven specific items, when you perceive or believe yourself to be the true religion, everybody else is what is said in that. So in technically, that applies to every single person who doesn't believe what their own religion says.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in this golden age, it's kind of bizarre, but I'm not sure why he's saying Jesus is going to come again and set up his kingdom. Didn't they believe that he already came and set up his kingdom in 1914? It's just a very odd statement. On the other hand, maybe the golden age reported it incorrectly. He's making overgeneralized statements. All these schools and colleges and seminaries, these Christian schools, they're all discarding the Bible and they don't believe in the Bible anymore. There were some that did that, but not all of them. There are a lot of real strong fundamentalists and evangelical universities that started at that time and have continued until today. He picks one example and says, oh, they're all like that. It's a very strange statement from him.
And it also questions, well, we've already figured out what the Bible, we are God's mouthpiece and interpret what the Bible says for you, but yet you keep changing it. Okay, then maybe everybody should start getting back to reading the Bible and doing a verse-by-verse topic. Because if it changes, you didn't have it before. So it's a big circle that you could go around with that logic of it.
I think that's why they changed the locus recently, because if you go verse by verse through it the way that they had believed it, it just doesn't make sense. But now they made the interpretation so generic, it just applies to the Jews then, because if they applied it in the future, it wouldn't fit their narrative. And that's why Rolf Feruli, in his book, My Beloved Religion and the Governing Body, says, hey, they've had to generalize a lot of things lately, and it's so watered down, so generic, that there's just nothing of substance anymore in the magazine.
And for those who don't know who that author is,
he was one who tried to support the Society's view of the 607 date, right?
So now that's his comment, and that's dealing with them.
Yeah, and he had credentials. He had university behind him.
In number really 4, have no over here on the slide, it says that they have selfish ambition. So when you use the credentials for what you want, but then others' credentials don't count, I mean, you got to be a little more fair.
And we discussed that in a previous discussion as well. We showed an example of selfish ambition, like the very first week or two right out of the gate after Russell's death. And it's not quite the narrative that the Watchtower presents. In that particular article, the same one where he writes about Macmillan, he says, it is within the bounds of possibility, if not probability, that some will be led astray by ambition or pride to have their own way now that the master director is gone. It is possible that some will become sulky and rebel against the arrangement. And the question is, well, why?
Now, the first thing I get out of this is the recalling of the latter story of Jehovah's Witnesses saying ambitious men were trying to steal the Watchtower and take over. Now, here very early, prior to all that came out, here we see a whole other show of evidence of, hey, we want to print it first. Hey, we want to control this. So it leaves a lot open. Who was really the ambitious people trying to take over the society, trying to control it? This is a good find for that, and the date of it is just perfect for all this.
The whole point of this is, hey, they didn't listen to me. That's it. They didn't listen and convert to the Bible students of the time. They willfully repudiated and rejected the teachings of Jesus. Well, the ones I presented, Rutherford is basically saying. This is fascinating because this proclamation he ties in with the sheep and the goats. And if you believe the sheep and the goats is this, and you've changed it to that, and this proclamation here is, your evidence that you have been chosen of Jehovah as his organization, and you don't believe what's in that proclamation anymore, what kind of evidence is that?
Well, it's like the glove doesn't fit when your hand's opening up like this to get into it. You got to kind of put it in and help make it fit. If it does, you can't not make it fit.
Well, you can try and shoehorn your foot into a shoe that doesn't quite fit, but it's real uncomfortable. The 1955 Watchtower says that the first time this was shown to be an earthly group was at this convention in 1923. That's not quite true, because that was what was generally understood for decades previous. So I'm not sure why they were saying it was the first time. It's a very strange statement. Some of these talks that were given at the convention were related to a series of articles that were published throughout 1923 in the Watchtower. What does Judge Rutherford's imprisonment, the parable of the sheep and the goats, and the Watchtower's second trumpet blast all have in common? Listen in to the end and we'll explain it all.